Yeah, welcome 2025. This one is interesting. What's good? It's Woog. We've got David Benavidez, 29 wins and 0 losses, taking on David Morrell, 11 wins and 0 losses. Under most circumstances, this fight wouldn't be happening at this time. We've got in his prime, undefeated, former 2-time 168-pound WBC champion, lost his belt twice, never in the ring. He lost it the first time due to recreational drugs, and he lost it the second time on the scale in the middle of the pandemic. This is like mid to late 2020 against Alexis Romer Angulo, which gave Canelo cover to storm the gates at 168 and be able to collect all 4 belts without having to fight David Benavidez. Remember, they made that first title challenge for Canelo against Callum Smith. They threw the WBC belt in the mix. It was supposed to just be for the WBA title, but since Benavidez lost his title on the score, or rather on the scale, the WBC just threw their belt into that Canelo title challenge against Callum Smith. And no, I'm not going to harp too long about David Benavidez and Canelo never fighting him, but ever since that point, the boxing communities looked at Canelo like, hey, so you gonna fight David? And even with David Benavidez proving himself against top tier competition, especially in recent fights, Canelo's more or less like, But David Benavidez, again, undefeated 2-time 168-pound champ, very much in his prime, just had one fight at 175 against former champ Alexander Gvozdyk. He's the guy who ended Adonis Stevenson's WBC champ reign at light heavyweight. So David Benavidez just beat him. And before that, in 2023, he beat Caleb Plant and Demetrius Andrade, becoming only the second to beat Caleb Plant and becoming the first to beat Demetrius Andrade, stopping him in the 6th round. And before those 2023 wins, I would say his best win was against former 2-time 175-pound champ Anthony Durrell. That was back on the Errol Spence versus Sean Porter undercard. That's back in 2019. So David Benavidez has been proving himself for like years now, and is, I would say, in a lot of people's like top 12, top 15. What's keeping him out of the top 10 is that he hasn't yet established supremacy in a division. At 168, he wasn't able to do so because the undisputed champ would not fight him. And now at 175, that division is occupied with the undisputed champ Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol as they gear up for their rematch next month. So they still have to resolve that saga before the winner of David Benavidez and David Morrell could get in that mix. So for those reasons, David Benavidez might not be in a lot of people's top 10s, but make no mistake, you know how a lot of people say, well, so-and-so is good, but they're not like a world beater. David Benavidez is more or less a world beater, which is why a lot of people want to see what Canelo can do with him. But the reason why this Benavidez versus Morrell fight is so unusual is that Morrell is a fighter who he's passing the eyeball test, right? He's only got 11 fights. He's a Cuban fighter, a very athletic southpaw, and he just looks like he's got all the tools. He's got strength, he's got speed, he's a sharpshooter puncher. He seems like he's got IQ, he's got length, he's got height. He checks a lot of those boxes that you would want if you were to design a fighter. And again, he's a southpaw, but he's very untested against like top tier competition. And so he's more or less like smoking these outmatched opponents. He knocked out Alantez Fox in the 4th round. I know Alantez Fox has fought, some other pretty good fighters, but he knocked Fox out in the 4th round. He knocked Yamaguchi Falcao, not the same Falcao who fought for that vacant middleweight belt against Vincenzo Gualtieri, who then lost to Janibek. Not that Falcao, but Yamaguchi Falcao got knocked out in the 1st round against David Morrell. David Morrell put a bad beating on Yerbasinuli, and he put him in the hospital. He was in an induced coma for a while. I heard that he wants to resume a boxing career, but yeah, Yerbasinuli was in really bad shape after fighting David Morrell. So David Morrell's been beating up on a lot of mid to lesser tier fighters, and this was at 168. So he was passing that eyeball test with flying colors, where a lot of people already thought that he was better than other really good 168 guys. Like a lot of people thought that he was better than Jaime Munguia. Most people think he's better than Edgar Berlanga. He would be one of those names that's floated out as people who would give Canelo trouble because, again, of his dimensions and because of everything that we're seeing. But what we see has not yet been tested against top tier competition. So I look at him as more so being a prospect. I know he's a contender, But in terms of what he's done and who he's done it against, he really on paper should be a prospect. It's just that he's been looking so good in most of these fights, and a lot of these divisions are somewhat thin to where it doesn't take a lot of beating top or near top guys to really get in the mix, especially with the promotional politics. There just isn't a lot of resistance. If you're looking the part and you're beating some decent names and you're doing it in the way that David Morrell had been doing it, yeah, you could see how his name floated to, near the top of the pile. But then he moved to 175 light heavyweight shortly after David Benavidez did. They more or less did around the same time. But while David Benavidez fought Alexander Gvozdyk, again, a former champion at light heavyweight whose only loss was to Artur Beterbiev in a high stakes title unification fight, David Morrell fought Hot Rod Kalajdzic, who, in fairness, was on a bit of a run. Like, Hot Rod's not a top-tier fighter, but Kalajdzic, he did knock out Sullivan Barrera, a very old Sullivan Barrera, but he knocked him out in the final round on Pro Box TV. So Kalajdzic did have some momentum going into the David Morrell fight, but that fight ended up looking like a bit of a stalemate. Like, David Morrell was edging the rounds, but it was a very, as they say, pedestrian or uninspiring performance. It had a lot of people scratching their head. I was actually at that fight. It was on the Crawford versus Madrimov undercard. I mean, it should be called Madrimov versus Crawford undercard because Madrimov was the champion. But yeah, it was in Los Angeles and it was way down on the undercard because, all these Riyadh season, and this was a Riyadh season LA card. So it was a stacked card. David Morrell had, I believe, like the first fight of the night. So I was still in line waiting to get my beer, waiting to get my drink. So I had just entered the venue and was in line, hadn't taken my seat yet because it was earlier in the evening. But I was able to see the fight. They have the big screens playing, as you walk around the venue. So I was able to see David Morrell kind of getting stymied, getting counterpunched, looking lethargic. I don't know if it was like the summertime heat, but he did not look like a world beater against Hot Rod. The official scores in that one were like 117, 111 on 2 cards, and then 118 to 110 on 1 card. I didn't see a 118 to 110 fight, maybe 117, 111. I wouldn't have been mad at a 116, 112 fight. So this was not a great showing for David Morrell. And you know how there's a recency bias in boxing where somebody could look great, then they look kind of shaky in one fight, then everybody's like, I'm not sure about that guy. I mean, Bout is going through that right now after that rematch against Karen Chukagian. But then it usually takes like one more really good performance and everybody will forget about that last bad performance. Well, David Morrell, right on the heels of that shaky performance against Kalajdzic, is now fighting David Benavidez. So usually David Morrell would have a few more fights before he fights somebody the caliber of David Benavidez. Usually that O in the loss column is protected as you kind of work up the rank, and you would start fighting guys with like names that are like post prime, like a Sullivan Barrera type, especially now that you have just entered light heavyweight. Or maybe you would fight like a Willie Hutchinson or Craig Richards, somebody of that caliber maybe at this stage of David Morrell's development. I mean, even that might be a little tough if you look at most fighters' career arcs and how they kind of step up gradually opponent wise. You don't just go right into one of the baddest dudes in the sport, David Benavidez. But since David Benavidez, yes, he did just fight Caleb Plant and Demetrius Andrade and Gvozdyk, but he's been having trouble getting some of the biggest fights, especially Canelo. But yeah, a little less so since he was able to fight Andrade. I mean, he was the only guy who was down to fight Andrade because Andrade had a lot of difficulty securing meaningful fights. By the way, Demetrius Andrade just had a really good interview. I think it was on Fight Hub TV. I would definitely encourage you to check that out. He gets into everything, including what the experience was like fighting David Benavidez. And Demetrius Andrade is a hilarious dude. Like, he basically said, I mean, he looks across the ring, sees this big old David Benavidez, and he's like, gulp. Like, he's very forthcoming and candid about what that experience was like. So David Benavidez now does have some very significant wins, and he is in line where if he beats Morrell, the winner of this Benavidez Morrell fight is likely gonna get a shot against the winner of Beterbiev versus Bivol, assuming that, Bivol doesn't win and then they make it a trilogy. I mean, you never know how those super mega matchups are going to play out. Sometimes it'll be multiple fights. Sometimes it'll even be 3 fights. But theoretically, the idea is that the person who wins this is in line for that title shot. So yeah, this is unusual for this type of a matchup to take place at this time. But I mean, these are or were two of the best 168 guys, at least in terms of reputation. Again, Benavidez way more proven than David Morrell, but it also works out because both of these guys are on the PBC. This is a PBC pay-per-view card. So here we are, David Benavidez versus David Morrell. And as a boxing fan, I ain't complaining. This is an excellent matchup, and there's a lot of intrigue because a lot of the intrigue is because there's so much mystery behind how good or how overhyped David Morrell might be. We don't know if he's the goods. We know David Benavidez is the goods. So how do I think this one is going to play out? Again, there's not a ton of tape on David Morrell, but we've seen what he's got. I mean, again, he's looking really fast, really strong, really sharp in all these fights that he's in. Again, the hot rod fight notwithstanding. And David Benavidez does get hit. I mean, he's got underrated defense. He is able to pull back from a lot of shots. He's able to use his length. Now, although both of these guys are like 6'1", 6'2", David Benavidez might be a shade taller than David Morrell, but David Morrell's got a significantly longer reach on paper. I was always kind of surprised when looking at David Benavidez's reach. It's usually listed at like 74. That's the same as Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford and David Benavidez on paper have the same reach, whereas David Morrell has like a 77, 78 inch reach, a reach that's more typical for a rangy 168, 175 guy. David Benavidez's reach is actually on the shorter side for somebody who, especially for somebody who's 6'1", 6'2", but also you look at David Benavidez's frame and how he looks in the ring. He usually looks enormous in the ring, and the way that he fights looks like he's got a long reach, but I think that it's because he's got underrated footwork that has him in position to let his hands go and be in range to connect without having like a 78 or 80 inch reach. But David Benavidez, although he's got underrated defense in my book, he does tend to get outboxed sometimes in the early rounds. Like Demetrius Andrade had some success in the first 2 to 3 rounds. Caleb Plant had really good success like in the first 4 to 5 rounds. But then things start turning south, and usually when they start turning south, they turn south quickly, and then it's usually all David Benavidez from that point forward. Now, when Benavidez fought Gvozdyk, he kind of hit a little bit of a speed bump, like at least a speed check. Not as badly as David Morrell hit it against Hot Rod Kalajdzic, but David Benavidez wasn't able to put Gvozdyk away. Gvozdyk was making good contact with Benavidez, and you saw David Benavidez was fighting somebody who was at least pretty much his size with good strength, good boxing ability. Gvozdyk was formidable in there. He wasn't winning a bunch of rounds, but he was making a lot of the rounds competitive. David Benavidez didn't just run away with that one. So I'm curious as to how David Morrell, is gonna grow into light heavyweight and what type of a physical presence he could have against Benavidez, because again, Benavidez seems like a strong guy in there. But David Morrell is a sharpshooter. He's rangy. Again, he's a southpaw. I expect him to maybe win the first 2 out of 3 rounds against Benavidez. I think that he's going to have early success. I think he's going to catch Benavidez kind of cleanly, and he does have good power. He's got 9 knockouts in 11 wins. Again, much lesser competition. I mean, David Benavidez has a high knockout percentage as well against much better competition. He's got 24 knockouts in 29 fights. But Morrell does have good power, at least he's got good 168 power. We don't know if he's got good light heavyweight power. We don't know really how David Benavidez's power is going to ultimately translate to 175. We know he wasn't able to put Gvozdyk away. He didn't even really visibly have Gvozdyk hurt to where Gvozdyk looked like he was wobbly, holding on for dear life. There wasn't that in that Benavidez-Gvozdyk fight. So I'm looking at this one like it's 2 168 guys who are fighting at 175. It would be like if Devin Haney and Ryan Garcia have their rematch at 147. I'll be looking at it like it's more or less 2 140 guys fighting at 147. So any of these guys light heavyweight shortcomings, I think it pretty much goes out the window, because I think that they are in the same stage in their physical growth, and they're pretty much very similar in age as well. David Benavidez just turned 28. David Morrell just turned 27. But when I look at how this one stylistically is going to play out, again, I think Morrell's going to have good success from the outside early on. Like you saw how Caleb Plant outboxed Benavidez early, right? So Benavidez, his whole thing is being able to turn the fight into a higher volume fight rather than a pot shot tit for tat exchange jabs and throw one punch, two punches at a time. No, David Benavidez wants to start rolling downhill, wants to start making this a battle of attrition, wants to see if you can keep up with his pace, because he throws pretty fast punches and they're accurate punches, and he's throwing to the body and he's throwing up top. He's just looking to wear you out, and if you can't do anything to either control distance, to move, or to get his respect to where he has to think twice before coming in, and maybe that's the trick. Maybe David Morrell's got a scary uppercut or something waiting for Benavidez if Benavidez continues to over pursue, which he often does. By the way, the turning point of Benavidez versus Andre, ironically, was a Benavidez uppercut that caught Andre super cleanly, changed the fight in that exact moment. Even if you thought Benavidez was already starting to turn things around by the point he landed that uppercut is what dropped Demetrius Andrade, and it was all downhill from there. But the question in this one is David Benavidez, who a lot of people accuse of being a weight bully, and I don't so much accuse him of being, he's just a big dude who was able to squeeze into 168. It is what it is. But if you look at his opponents, David Lemieux was a 160 guy fighting him at 168. Kyron Davis, a smaller fighter stature-wise. Same thing with Ronald Ellis. Anthony Durrell was a true, again, multiple-time champion at 175, so that was a legit light heavyweight. He was a little bit long in the tooth, but even that one was a very competitive fight. And again, Caleb Plant through about 5 rounds was very competitive. So if David Morrell is about the same size as David Benavidez, it would be interesting to see how David Benavidez can handle not somebody in the 30s, but somebody who's even a little bit younger than him, about the same size, and arguably punch for punch a sharper operator. David Benavidez, I don't think from distance is going to be able to just outbox David Morrell. I mean, maybe he will, but I think that he's going to have to make this start looking like a David Benavidez fight to really take control. And I do eventually expect that to happen. I don't know if that turning point will come sooner than expected, like it did against Demetrius Andrade, or if it's going to take a while for that change to happen. So the question is, will Morrell bank a lot of those early rounds? How many of those early rounds? Will Morrell win like 3 out of the first 4? Because if that's the case, then, you know, David Benavidez more or less has his work cut out for him. He's got to turn things around. If Morrell is up 4 rounds to 2 after 6 rounds, same thing. Benavidez has to take over in the second half of the fight. Either has to stop him or win the vast majority of the rounds, but you can't give up many of those second half rounds if you start falling behind on the scorecard. So that's the way I look at a lot of Benavidez fights. Okay, if you're going to lose a couple of the early rounds, at what point does that turnaround happen? Does it happen in the 4th round? Does it happen in the 7th round? And there's a question of whether it happens at all. We don't know. We know David Morrell can box. We don't know if David Morrell can fight. We know David Benavidez can fight. And for me, that's the difference. That's why I have faith that this one is going to turn around, because I've seen David Benavidez do it on multiple occasions. And he's done it against guys way more tested and proven than David Morrell. So I think that this one is going to turn, but I think it's going to turn a little bit late. I think it's going to start looking a little shakier for David Morrell from like the 6th round on. And I think that David Benavidez is going to start taking control by like the 6th, 7th round. And at that point, I expect David Morrell, who's going to be wanting space to operate, who's going to be wanting to move and to buy time, I think that he's going to start looking like he's in distress. We're going to start seeing him hold more. We're going to start seeing him do little things to try to weather the storm. Maybe start moving away from David Benavidez and then throwing like 1 or 2 hard shots just to kind of keep David Benavidez honest, and then getting back on your bike. I think that David Morrell is going to start getting turned around, where he's not going to be able to stand his ground and hold the center of the ring in the way that he was able to in the first few rounds. So I do think that this is going to take on the tone of most David Benavidez fights. I was tempted, and I have been tempted to take David Benavidez by stoppage, because again, we haven't seen David Morrell tested to that degree where he's in deep distress, where he's got to like really dig deep to gut it out, show his survival instincts. We haven't seen David Morrell in trouble. Again, he's passed the hell out of the eyeball test, but that can only take you so far. We've seen fighters who look really, really good against lesser competition and then hit a wall once they're really, really met with adversity. You know what fighter just came to mind? Or actually, remember Edwin Rodriguez La Bamba? He was an undefeated fighter looking really good against lesser competition for like a while. Then he started stepping it up. He still looked really good. He was on a lot of HBO cards. Then he fought Andre Ward. He lost via unanimous decision. Then he got involved in like all of these like wars, most of which he was winning, but he stopped looking sharp. He stopped looking like really defensive. He stopped looking like that shiny new object that all of these kind of new, like think Boots Ennis, think whoever the new hot shot is today, whether you think it's Diego Pacheco or one of these, you know, Abdullah Mason. I know he got dropped a couple times, but you know, any one of these shiny new objects, Boots Ennis has been that in recent years. It doesn't take much to break that mystique, and once that mystique is truly broken, you never really get that shine back. I wonder if this is going to be that type of a fight for David Morrell. We'll see. Maybe he comes in here and he shows out, and maybe he even beats David Benavidez. I don't see it. In fact, the odds, I think, are closer than they should be. Like, this is one of those really close and near even fights odds wise. Yes, Benavidez is a favorite, but he's only a -175, so he's less than a 2-to-1 favorite. David Morrell is a +185, so I think that this should be more like David Benavidez, at least at a -250, something like that. But that just shows how good David Morrell's looked in most of these fights. But I'm gonna break with the odds makers here. I'm more or less going with David Benavidez somewhat comfortably. Again, I know David Morrell can box. I don't know if he could fight. I know David Benavidez can box, he can fight, he's got IQ, he's got volume, he starts picking things up even more in the second half of the fight, so he's got a hell of an engine, he's got a pretty good chin. I know he's been dropped and buzzed in the past, but for all intents and purposes, he looks pretty damn durable, and he just gets increasingly nasty in there. Like he's in there for blood, you know what I mean? So I think the odds makers have it wrong. And again, I was going to go David Benavidez via stoppage, but I'm actually gonna give Morrell the benefit of the doubt and say that he's got enough athletic ability, boxing skill, and just talent overall to where he could do enough to make it through this fight without being stopped. I think that he's gonna be able to make it through the 12 rounds, but I think that he might get dropped. I think it might look really ugly by the end of it. He might even be holding on and, you know, falling to his knees. He might get dropped multiple times. I don't know, but I'm going David Benavidez to start pulling away on the scorecards, and I think he's going to win a unanimous decision against David Morrell. Now, if he gets a stoppage here, then David Benavidez's career is looking pretty golden, but I think Morrell's going to do enough to survive the 12 rounds. I'm taking Benavidez via decision, but it would be something if David Morrell is so good at boxing that he's able to keep this at range and be able to charge David Benavidez, to quote Teddy Atlas, for the real estate. Like, David Benavidez wants to start throwing hands and starts making this a higher volume fight and then pays for it dearly. And then if David Morrell can force Benavidez to reduce his volume, then Morrell's got a shot at winning this one. But if David Benavidez could start picking up the pace like he normally does, I could see him start rolling downhill on David Morrell. So that's what I'm going to go with, Benavidez via decision. Let me know your thoughts on this one. This is a very compelling, interesting matchup, and it's an unusual matchup given where these two undefeated fighters are in their careers. And props for David Benavidez for taking this higher risk, lower reward challenge. Like, it's not no reward, but it's relatively low reward because most people don't really know who David Morrell is. Those who have seen him see somebody who appears pretty damn talented. And David Benavidez, again, multiple time champion who's also beaten multiple former champs and guys with names. Like, he didn't have to take this David Morrell fight, but he doesn't appear to be ducking smoke either. So yeah, props to Benavidez for taking this one, and props to David Morrell for taking this challenge at this relatively early stage in his career. Again, this is only like his 12th pro fight. So yeah, I'm going Benavidez via decision. Let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. And also let me know if you think David Benavidez or David Morrell, but let's just say David Benavidez because we've seen him a lot longer. Does he have a chance at beating Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol? Let me know your thoughts on that as well in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.